Thank you so much for joining us for our press conference to address recent concerns about a draft gender inclusion policy currently working its way through the policy development process at UND. My name is David Dodds, and I am the Communications Director for the University of North Dakota. I'm joined today on the panel by UND President Andrew Armacost, Donna Smith, Assistant Vice President for Equal Opportunity and Title IX, and Troy Noldner, Director of Housing at UND. They are here to help answer media questions about the draft policy. Just a quick note that we are recording the press conference so it can be shared later. Before we get to media questions, I would first like to turn the floor over to President Armacost for his opening remarks. President Armacost.
Thank you, Dave, and good morning. I'm Andrew Armacost, and I serve as the president of the University of North Dakota. Thank you for joining us. I'm here today to address your questions about our university's draft policy on gender inclusion. On Tuesday, the North Dakota Catholic Conference Director, Christopher Dodson, issued a letter to constituents that raised concern about this draft policy. We respect his opinions and ideas, which I've carefully considered as we reviewed this draft policy. I reached out to Mr. Dodson yesterday, and we had a good discussion about our points of agreement and our points of disagreement. I also assured him that his concerns are important as we consider our actions on the draft policy. The University of North Dakota is committed to the well-being of all members of our campus community. Those who have heard me talk about my core values know that my first principle is to love your people. Each student or employee is entitled to be protected from harassment or discrimination. The draft policy is intended to state our support to our LGBTQ+ members, and in particular, to our transgender and non-binary members, with that same guarantee of access to education and fair employment without fear of discrimination or harassment. This is part of what it means to love your people. Let me address the basis of this draft policy. Federal law, supported by Supreme Court and federal court decisions, have added sexual orientation and gender identity as protected classes for discrimination in employment and in education. The state of North Dakota similarly offers protections. In fact, in 2020, the State Departments of Labor and Human Rights announced it was adding sexual orientation and gender identity to its list of human rights laws the department enforces. State law is also informative with its definitions of free speech and discriminatory harassment in education. And finally, the State of North Dakota Board of Higher Education adopted a system-wide policy, NDUS 503, that describes the use of chosen name and legal names in our university's systems. This draft policy came as the result of the work of a campus committee, the changes to NDUS policy, and the changes we saw in federal law. These are the same laws that led to the changes made by the State Department of Labor and Human Rights that I cited earlier. The goal of this draft policy was to address issues of gender identity and expression in one accessible document. Since the public comment period, legislators have raised their concerns, and we have had helpful conversations with them. We have learned a lot about their opinions in these conversations. Each conversation I have about this policy, whether for or against, is useful. Now let me address specific elements of Mr. Dodson's letter that I believe need clarification. The first is failure to adhere to the policy would be a violation of UND's discrimination and harassment policy. This is not the case. Referring to someone by the wrong gender could only be a policy violation if it was done intentionally and meets the definition of harassment, that the behavior is so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that it denies a person equal access to UND programs and activities. This is consistent with the definition adopted by the state legislature in the last legislative session regarding student-on-student harassment. The second statement, the proposed policy applies to on-campus housing, which UND requires for all freshmen. This is a misleading statement, as it implies that a student is locked into a particular living arrangement. There are exceptions granted to this requirement for any number of reasons. The process of getting an exception is well described in our housing policy manual. Further, the process of making a roommate change is also well described. The third statement, an individual will be assigned housing according to their expressed gender rather than their biological sex. This is not true. The draft policy doesn't discuss the specifics of the housing assignment process. The language in the draft policy is intended to offer assurance that trans and gender nonconforming students will be provided access to housing consistent with their gender identity. Here's how the process works. Students are assigned to housing roommates based upon their legal sex. The housing office will work with students whose legal sex is not consistent with their gender identity to identify a living arrangement that would allow them to be most successful. In situations where a gender-neutral assignment is made, all roommates must agree to that assignment. Students, as I mentioned before, are also able to change roommates for any reason. The fourth statement. In fact, no one apparently can inquire about the individual's actual sex. As I just noted, housing decisions are, in fact, made based on biological sex. The consequence of Mr. Dodson's statements has yielded widespread confusion and misinterpretation about the draft policy among many people in the community. Furthermore, there was no imminent approval of this draft policy, and I'm confused by the timing of this letter, which insinuated an urgency that, frankly, wasn't there. In fact, because of the Catholic Conference's comments on the draft policy we received in October, I had cautioned my staff that we need to take our time in revising this policy to consider the wide set of inputs we had received and to seek additional input. As I look for common points of agreement, here is the important concept that I think we both agree on. How do we create a campus environment that is safe for everyone and free of harassment and discrimination? This applies to our LGBTQ+ groups and to our religious groups alike. The federal government, the Supreme Court, and the state of North Dakota describe what it takes to create such an environment. As the leader of this great public university, I have an unwavering commitment to ensure each and every human being on our campus is treated with the dignity and respect and is afforded protections under the law. With me today, as introduced by Dave, are Donna Smith, our Assistant Vice President for Equal Opportunity and Title IX, and Troy Noldner, our Director of Housing and Residence Life. They will join me in answering your questions. Dave, back to you.
Thank you, President Armacost. I'd like to remind our audience who may have tuned in a little bit later that we are recording this news conference, and so that we have the ability to share it on YouTube later and to distribute that link accordingly. Now I will turn the floor over for questions from the media. If you have a question for our panelists, go ahead and use the raise hand function on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then I can call on you and unmute your mic so you can ask your question and any follow-ups you might have. We have reserved this time for members of the media. So if you are a non-media member of our audience, we appreciate your attendance today, but respectfully ask that you yield this Q&A session to members of the media. To the members of the media, if you would please state your name and news outlet that you represent, and then ask your question. With that, we can begin. Are there any questions for our panelists? And we do. I am going to start with WDAY News. Go ahead and ask your question.
Matt Henson here with WDAY. Thank you for holding this press conference today. I guess the first question, we understand UND is the first in the state university system to draft such a policy. Why did UND want to be a leader in this?
Well, I'll begin with that question, and thank you for that wonderful question and insight. The fact is, both the system and most, if not all, individual universities within and colleges within the system have statements about gender inclusion in their non-discrimination statements. So gender identity is something that's part of our discrimination policies already, and that's statewide and it's system-wide. And UND had a committee looking at the use of preferred name and preferred pronouns in our campus information systems. In fact, we were doing this on behalf of the North Dakota University system. The conversations that coalesced in the course of that work actually led to this draft policy. And there were a number of other factors, including the changing landscape at the federal level and changing court cases that influenced the construction of this particular draft policy. And let me also turn it over to Donna Smith, who was part of that committee, in fact, chaired that committee. So Donna.
Thank you, President Armacost. I think you really captured that very well. The only other thing that I would add is just to echo a statement that you had made previously, in that the intent of the policy was to try to gather information and provide guidance to our campus community members in one accessible place. Given the changing landscape and many different things that were going on, we wanted to provide a place for our campus community members to go and find the policies and procedures that applied specifically to this issue.
And let me add one more comment too, and that is, as we've noted, our campus is committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and our LGBTQ community, and in particular our trans and gender non-binary community, have faced discrimination. And it's important to articulate the resources and the policy guidance and the laws that actually apply to situations that they might be facing here on campus.
Thank you, President Armacost. I'm going to move to Joel Crane. Joel, you're up. Joel, do you have a question for the panel?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. This is Joel Crane with KFYR TV in Bismarck. I spoke to Chris Dodson yesterday, and he said that the problem with the policy is that it's so broad in one direction that it doesn't make UND a friendly and inclusive place for people that think that gender is biologically determined. So what do you have to say about that? I mean, yeah, I'll just say that.
I've spoken with Christopher Dodson as well. And as I noted in my opening comments, the inputs that the Catholic Conference provided to us have been quite useful for us to understand that important balance between rights for non-discrimination, but also rights to free expression and free practice of religion. And in fact, the reason we have not published anything, and we're taking the process of the next revision to the draft policy slowly, is because those are important topics and important inputs for us to address. We recognize that constitutional issues such as the ones that Christopher has raised are important, and we need to make sure that we take the time to address those the proper way. Donna Smith, any additional comments?
Only to clarify that certainly was not the intent of the policy. And again, this is the reason that these comment periods are so important, and we do really value input from others. While we may think that as we're drafting the policy, and this was a group of about 15 or so individuals from various places across campus who came together and worked very hard on the policy. And while we may think that we are clear in that our intentions match the words, sometimes when others read it, we find out that's not the case. And so this is a very important exercise for us in the way that we move through all of our policy development. So we do value that input.
Next up is Adam Kurtz of the Grand Forks Herald. Go ahead, Adam.
Hi, this is Adam from the Herald. President Armacost, you said that the need for this policy comes from federal and state rules, also SBHE policies. You said 503. I'm not seeing a specific reference in 503 to pronouns. So the creation of this policy, would this be UND's interpretation of that policy? Because as I understand it, other schools are not working on policies like this, at least not yet.
Thank you for the question. There are a number of parts to the draft policy, one of which is a description of how our university data systems store preferred names and legal names. And the reference to NDUS, it's actually procedure, I must have misstated it, procedure 503, is actually a connection between what's stated in our policy, which exactly mirrors what's stated in that NDUS procedure 503. And so, so when I referenced that, it was really to connect that particular part of the policy to higher level guidance.
Thank you, President Armacost. Next, I have representation from the media from Prairie Public. Go ahead. Prairie Public, do you have a question?
Are you hearing me now?
Yes.
Okay, very good. This is more of a process question. Now that you've gotten some feedback, and now that you said that the policy is still in draft mode, President Armacost, what are the next steps before the policy is adopted?
Well, just as I mentioned in my opening comments, we've had ongoing discussions since the comment period about issues that we see, the conflicts that we've heard in inputs from constituents. It's important for us to, as I said, make sure we take a very deliberate approach to examine what the appropriate next steps are as we continue those discussions. The outcome of those it could be any number of steps, and the actions that we can take on this draft policy can range anywhere from accepting the draft as is, revising the draft, or rescinding the draft and embedding the things that we think are important in other policies. It might also be the case that we feel there is sufficient coverage in all of our existing policies to cover the concerns here. I would anticipate that to take a process of months, and we're in no hurry I know the public is now watching us very carefully, but I think we need to make sure that we get this right. We will open up opportunities for comments across the campus and engagement with key stakeholders who have approached us previously.
Okay, we'll go to James McPherson with the Associated Press out of Bismarck. Go ahead, James, when you're ready.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, James.
Okay, thank you. Has there been problems with discrimination at the university?
I can say in my conversations with students, I have had reports of discrimination. Yes. I think Donna Smith can probably answer the extent to which discrimination happens on our campus, since those are reported to her office. And maybe we can answer your question specifically about discrimination, which is typically aligned with employment issues. But I think Donna will probably address issues of harassment that happen on campus in the educational context. Donna?
Yes, thank you. We do have issues, have reports of discrimination and harassment that come through our office, through my office, and a number of issues, but including issues of gender identity. And that was, at least in part, the impetus for putting together some of this language in one place where people could easily access it. We know that for many people, this is a new issue. Can be very uncomfortable. People don't understand. And we wanted to be able to help support all members of our community in how to appropriately deal with a situation that might come forward to avoid situations of discrimination and harassment. But to more specifically answer your question, we do have a few cases every year that come through my office in the form of a formal report, because we know that many of these concerns go unreported. I really couldn't tell you how much larger the problem is, because we just know that this is an issue that does not frequently get reported through official means.
Okay.
And one other response, if I may, Dave.
Yes.
I mentioned anecdotal inputs that I've received from students. One came, in fact, as recently as yesterday from a transgender woman on campus who told her experience with extreme gender identity discrimination that she faced on our campus. And most importantly, the devastating impact that it had on her. And when you hear these stories, it goes back to my opening comments. When we talk about taking care of and loving our people, that means everybody on our campus. And that means we have to make sure that the environment that we have here and the expectations that we have of the behaviors on our campus are such that nobody has to face that type of discrimination.
Thank you. We have a number of follow-up questions that are accumulating right now. We will get to those. I just want you to rest assured. Next on my list is, let's see here, Patty Armstrong. Patty, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Thank you for taking my question. I'm with Beck TV, and I'm wondering, it sounds like in your explanation so far that the policies you're talking about already do exist. I haven't heard you saying we would change anything. We would like to do this and we're doing this now. Instead, I keep hearing that you already are doing those things. And the only change I'm hearing is that you would be putting it all in one place. Is that correct, or did I miss any changes?
I'll allow Donna to answer the specifics of that, but many of the items that are in that policy, as I mentioned in my opening comments, our goal was to have an accessible document that points to existing laws or existing policies. The example that I talked about before about describing the process by which our computer systems actually store preferred names is one of those examples. We do nothing in that policy document other than to parrot what's written in the NDUS procedure. I think the issue that is probably going to be of most conversation is the issue of whether we're a compelling use of pronouns and what the free speech rights are for the rest of the campus. And so let me turn it over to Donna to address some more specifics.
Sure. Thank you, President Armstrong. Thank you, Patty. So yes, you are mostly correct in that what is in this proposed policy already exists elsewhere in other policies. The one example or one exception to that would be what President Armacost was just discussing related to use of legal names and chosen names. While there is a state board procedure that addresses that, UND didn't have that in our policies anywhere. So that would be something that was new. The remainder of this policy was really intended to provide more clarification, more specific clarification as those policies relate to issues of gender identity. Overall, with the exception of that use of legal and chosen name section, it really would not change what we are already doing on campus to respond to issues of discrimination and harassment based on gender identity. And those are the same things that we've been doing at UND for many, many years, as informed by both federal and state law and state board policy.
And the sections that tie to state board policy and to federal law are expectations of a broader set of campuses, not merely UND.
Okay, next on my media queue is representation from iNewZ. iNewZ, go ahead and identify yourself and ask your question. iNewZ, are you muted? Okay, I'm going to, we can come back to you. iNewZ, I'm going to put you back on mute and move to my first follow-up question from Matt Henson at WDAY TV.
Thank you again, President Armacost and Dave. President, could we please get your reaction to Mayor Bochinsky's comments yesterday, calling this policy a spit in the face and a sad day for the university? I understand you called them rather quickly after his comments. Can we get your reaction to those comments and what was said to the mayor?
I won't comment about what was said to the mayor, but let me assure your viewers and readers out there that as organizations and as leaders make complicated decisions, we're going to differ in opinions on many things. And I think what's really important for people to understand is the mayor and I have a strong relationship, a professional relationship that we've worked hard on a large number of issues, responding to the pandemic, economic development in the city of Grand Forks. And I think what we will continue to do is show how we can disagree on certain issues and still arrive at great solutions for the city of Grand Forks and for the university.
Quick follow-up. He said he wanted to know the exact issues that you've had. He said you should really only adopt policy if there's a problem. He claims there isn't a problem. Would you agree or disagree about
Matt,
that?
I'll refer back to our earlier comments to a previous question. Donna Smith gave evidence of there being a problem, and I offered specific anecdotal evidence from a conversation I had as recently as yesterday about a problem existing. So the intent of clarifying what we do on campus to respond to these is quite important, particularly in this issue to the transgender and gender nonconforming community.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Okay, President Armacost, I do have a question that was submitted through the Q&A function from KNOX radio here in Grand Forks. And this may be one that Donna can assist in. How many current UND students would be affected by this policy if it was implemented today? Are applicants asking for this information? And if so, roughly how many?
Thank you.
I'll begin. Let me just begin by saying a policy like this applies to everyone, simply because when you're dealing with discrimination issues, it's important for the entire campus to know and to look out for examples of discrimination. And so really, this is about the entire community of our campus and how we treat people with dignity and respect. Donna?
Sure, thank you. And I would add to that, it's really difficult to put, to the extent you're asking how many students on our campus might identify as transgender or gender non-binary. It's really difficult to put a number on that because, of course, we are not requiring students to tell us that, and so it's would only be a guess. And in terms of how many applicants are asking for this information, we do have. I don't work in the admissions office, so I also can't give you a specific number on that, but we do have conversations with students every year about these issues as they are applying or as they are, after they've been admitted and they are deciding whether they want to come to the university. I also can tell you we had a situation where a student was admitted to the university and then decided to go elsewhere because of concerns that came that he experienced or that they experienced during the during the application and during the admissions process, and so it is it is an issue.
And we have a follow-up from KNOX radio as well. Doug Barrett with KNOX asks, you have mentioned moving slow on the draft policy. What is the timeline for completing the draft?
I haven't created a timeline. It will be a patient process to make sure we gather the right inputs from key stakeholders, both on campus and off campus. And again, this will be a matter of months, not weeks or days.
Our next follow-up question goes back to Adam Kurtz of the Grand Forks Herald. Adam, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Okay, thank you. This is a question for Donna and maybe for President Armacost as well. But Donna, in late October, you told me you can't recall an instance of a person filing a complaint related to their gender identity. Does that remain the case today? And then I'll just ask my follow-up for President Armacost. Given that anecdote of a transgender person, you said you spoke to a transgender person who experienced harassment that impacted them. Can UND take action on behalf of a student without a formal complaint?
So I can try to answer both of those, and let me know if I don't hit them both. Excuse me. To my recollection and to my knowledge, we have not had a formal complaint. And so I'll differentiate between a report and a formal complaint because we do look at those as two different things. We have reports that come through our office from students and employees who want to let us know that they feel they experienced discrimination or harassment or some other treatment that they want to let us know about. And that report is different from filing a formal complaint. The majority of the time, actually, when individuals file those reports with us, they're looking for support. We try to provide that support to them so that they can continue with their academic career at UND, be successful in their educational programs, continue to be a successful UND employee, but they don't file a formal complaint. Formal complaint would be the next step and would involve formal investigation and a determination about whether a policy was violated. So to my knowledge and to my recollection, we have not had a formal complaint based on gender identity, but we certainly have had reports of conduct that have come through my office. And can you repeat the second part of your question, Adam?
Just a second. Oh, go ahead, Adam.
Oh, sorry, Dave. Sorry. Yep. Can UND take action or do something without a formal complaint? I mean, if you get a report of a certain kind of behavior or something like that, then what happens then? Is it just a report, or you only take action after it becomes a complaint, right?
So under Title IX, which is the federal law that applies to the university as an institution of higher education and prohibits discrimination based on sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity, the university needs a formal complaint to begin a formal resolution process, which could be an investigation, could be another type of resolution, but we need to have that formal complaint either from the person who experienced the behavior themselves, or it could come from me as the Title IX coordinator. But even without that, we can, as a university, try to remedy the situation, try to improve the situation by providing supports to the individual who experienced the conduct, or having conversations with involved parties about how their behavior may have impacted someone else. We wouldn't take any formal disciplinary action in a situation like that if we didn't have a formal complaint, and two, a finding that our policy was actually violated.
Okay, a follow-up question from James McPherson with AP in Bismarck. This is in the Q&A function. Have students ever been expelled for discriminating against someone in the LGBTQ community?
So I will take a stab at answering that. Actually, at UND, expulsion has only been a potential disciplinary action in the last couple of years. Prior to that, we have had varying lengths of suspension. And in my almost 8 years here, we have not had a situation where a student was suspended for that type of behavior.
Okay. Next, I'm going to move back to Patty Armstrong. Patty, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Actually, I didn't have another question. I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't know how maybe I just hit a button in the wrong way, but yeah, just keep going. I'm enjoying listening to this.
Thank you so much for being with us today. I will move to Joe Bucharest. Apologies for the last name, Joe. He represents the Catholic News Agency. How many Catholic students are on your campus? Is there a religious breakdown available somewhere? And speaking as the communication director, I don't know that there is, but I can work with the appropriate folks on campus to find the appropriate information for you, Joe. But I open it up to the panel if they have any other thoughts on that.
I don't have any of those data. However, I know we have an active Newman Center on campus, and I'm certain that they can also provide data on their active participation there.
and I would just weigh in, is Troy Nolan, Director of Housing and Residence Life, through my work with admissions, through the application process to the university, there's no question on the application that would ask for religious information, and it's definitely nothing on our housing application either. So I'm not sure where that information would be centered at.
Thanks, Troy. Donna, President. Another question from James McPherson on the Q&A. James asks, wouldn't the complaint to the president yesterday be considered quote unquote formal? Why or why not?
So I can answer that one. Also, a formal complaint under Title IX is actually a written document that's either signed by the individual or, and we have a form because we have many forms. We have a form for the individual to complete and sign, and Title IX differentiates again between that report and a formal complaint. So it would not be a formal complaint, it would be a report.
It would also require probably somebody to be a current student.
Yes.
Next question comes from Adam Kurtz of the Grand Forks Herald. UND is open to modifying the language in the policy, correct? What is the likelihood of finding a solution that will satisfy all concerned parties?
Let me start with this one, and as the chair of the committee that looked at this, Donna might want to add. I think my comments about the question about working with the mayor probably gives some insights into how I view these types of challenges where we have different perspectives. I would anticipate changes to parts of the draft policy. And I would also hope that we could come up with a solution that satisfies everyone involved in this discussion. And that's a great hope. But again, I keep in mind that we have to care for the needs of everybody on our campus. And that's our LGBTQ plus members. It's also our members who have a particular religious affiliation, and many others on our campus as well. We're highly devoted to make sure that this campus is the best that it can be.
I would add to that. Oh, sorry, I would say I would add to that just real briefly that I will be meeting again with the group that drafted the policy, and we will take into consideration the comments that we've received and the concerns from individuals. And I'm confident that we can craft a policy that complies with the law and, hopefully addresses the concerns of most individuals, because I agree with the president, this is very important. But it's also very important, we have to balance the rights of all of the members of our campus community. And that's where this can be really, really tricky and difficult work. And we need to take our time with it.
Matt Henson from WDAY TV asks, if someone doesn't feel comfortable living with someone who is transgender, would that be viewed as discrimination?
So I can. Okay,
go ahead, Donna. We talked about this issue yesterday.
Yeah. So I can answer that. We have, and Troy can certainly chime in too as it relates to housing. And we have students, I know we have students who change roommates for any reason or for no reason, and that is totally fine. The definition of harassment, both in our policy and in the law, is conduct that's objectively offensive and so severe and pervasive that it effectively denies a person equal access to their educational opportunities, housing, in this case, to housing. I think it is very, we obviously would look at every situation on a case-by-case basis, but I think it's unlikely that a roommate switch would be so, or a request to have a roommate switch would be so severe and pervasive that it denied one of those individuals access to housing, because in that case, what housing would do would be make sure we had appropriate housing accommodations for both students, and so that we were providing equal access to both of them. We certainly wouldn't want, and I know I can speak for Troy on this too, we certainly wouldn't want to put students in a living arrangement where either one of them were uncomfortable. That's not good for anybody. That's not That's not good for their educational experience. That's not what this policy would do and not what we do currently.
Okay, I'm looking at my screen and I think, well, looks like we just had another follow-up question from Matt Henson from WDAY pop up. Most students say UND does an excellent job at communicating with the campus. But even though this was drafted in June, many claim they did not know about this until this week.
So I can try to address the way the policy was developed and the notices that went out to campus. And so first, the policy was developed using exactly the same policy development process that we use for all policies, which I will say is very rigorous. And we are gathering campus input throughout the process. In this case, well, so let me back up a second. So we have the idea for a policy. We take it to the executive committee with an impact statement and talk to them about the fact that we think there's a need for this policy. Let's have a conversation about whether this is something we want to look into further and begin the drafting process. That happened in this case. Then a group of campus members got together, spent several months drafting the policy. It was then reviewed by a committee on campus called the Policy Advisory Group, so that they had an opportunity to give input. It then is made available to campus members for comment for 2 weeks. Just like every other policy is. The notices go out in several different ways to a number of different listservs. They go to staff government, they go to student government, they go to our Senate government. In this case, announcements were distributed on October 8th, beginning October 8th, and throughout that comment period, which then ended on October 22nd, I believe. And so we know that we get a lot of emails, and I think people, may have just missed it in the rush, but it was included with actually a long list of other policies that were up for comment at that same time.
Okay, we have one last question from Matt, and then I'm going to move to James from AP after that. So Matt, I'm going to unmute you. I know you submitted a question on Q&A, but go ahead and ask your last question.
Yes, thank you for taking all of our questions today. This is, I believe, for President Armacost. Is there a fear that state lawmakers may cut state funding if this policy passes in some form?
I think the relationship with our legislators is essential. And I know I mentioned in my opening comments, we had several group meetings with local legislators. I've been on the phone over the last couple of days, of course, with legislators from across the state. One of the most important things I can do as president is to make sure that the relationship with those legislators is strong, and that they have the information, they have an understanding of why we're considering certain policy decisions, and to make sure that I listen to their input very, very carefully. I think throughout the legislative session, my first one last spring, I think I demonstrated that very strongly on behalf of UND. I know that there will be lingering concerns with legislators. I hope to address those directly with them. But furthermore, I can't speculate about the actions that they may or may not take with regard to funding. I can express our appreciation for the great support that they've shown to not just UND, but all of higher ed over the last session.
James, you have a similar line of questioning. I don't know if what President Armacost has just said has answered your questions, but I'm going to unmute you if you want to take a stab at any more questions for the president.
That was a very similar question to what I wanted to ask, is that there was concern that the legislature may attempt to reverse whatever policy ultimately comes out. The legislature has defeated legislation several times in past years that would ban discrimination based on sexual orientation in housing, government, public services, and workplace. So is there a concern that the legislature ultimately would try to overturn this, reverse the policy?
My primary comment is the same, that working closely with the legislators gives us insights into what they're thinking. And I know they have the power to enact state laws. And I think the important thing that we've talked about throughout is what this policy attempts to do is to recognize where those federal laws and state laws actually impact gender identity and gender inclusion issues on our campus. Again, there's, as I mentioned before, there's open discussion about an important discussion about the balance of protections for non-discrimination and the concern about infringement on free speech rights and free practice of religion. So what I would hope is that we can work out sensible policies that won't trigger any kind of reaction. But if there is a reaction, I'm sure that the legislators will give us ample information about the rationale why they're doing it.
All right, I've exhausted my list of media questions in my queue. We're just past the 45-minute mark. I offer up some time for any closing remarks that the president may have or any of the panelists.
I wanted just to thank everybody who chose to participate today, spending the time to hear what has been on the minds of us, not just in the last few days, but over the course of the beginning of crafting this policy. I hope what you've learned is that deliberate efforts were taken to construct a policy that's sensible and that protects the rights of all the members of our campus. Furthermore, I hope we've demonstrated an interest by the university, by myself, and by the leaders that you've heard from today to listen very carefully to the concerns as we move forward.
Thank you so much, President Armacost, Donna Smith, Troy Noldner, and everyone who's on the Zoom call with us today. We really appreciate your attendance.